This week on Just Solutions. In his new book, How We Win the Civil War, Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good, best-selling author Steve Phillips charts the way forward for progressives and people of colour. After 4 years of Trump, he argues that Democrats must recognise the nature of the fight that we're in, which is a contest between democracy and white supremacy, left unresolved after the Civil War. Steve Phillips is the founder of Democracy in Colour and host of the podcast of the same name. In his new book, he argues that the time has come to finish the conquest of the Confederacy and all that it represents. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Steve, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for being our guest on Just Solutions.
Thanks for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
I'd like to talk about the title of the book, How We Win the Civil War, and going back to the impetus for you to write this. And I know it all began back in early 2020, and then January 6th happened. So take us through the impetus for writing the book, the title, and then we'll connect that up to what happened on January 6th, because you addressed that right at the start.
Yeah, so I did a previous book, Brown is the New White, published by the New Press in 2016. And I was concerned at that point that people didn't understand how and why Obama won and what the political implications of that were. And that really his election was a result of the changing demographics in the country and an extension of the civil rights movement. And people were discounting that. So I was trying to demonstrate that there is a new American majority of people of color and progressive whites. That's the rising political force. And then the publisher came to me in 2020 and they were asking, do I want to write another book? And I said, yeah, why don't we use the Civil War as a metaphor to explain this current moment, particularly given how Trump had come to be elected, how much he demonized people of color, how much he was apologetic defender of white nationalism. And we use the Civil War as a metaphor. This is April of 2020. And then in January, people carrying the Confederate flag, wearing sweatshirts saying MAGA Civil War, January 6, 2021, stormed the United States Capitol and tried to stop the democratic peaceful transfer of power. And I said, well, it's not so metaphorical anymore. And then as I was doing the work and the research and really trying to make the argument, it was becoming clearer to me how the Confederates have never stopped fighting. And that really to this day, they have continued to fight for the Confederate conception that this should be a primarily white nation.
Well, I know that you have talked in your previous book and certainly in your latest book as well, and through all of your work, Steve, you talk about how we need to view what's happening politically and in society through the prism and the lens of race, and how that's not often being done. And in fact, you frame this in your new book as a choice between democracy and whiteness. So expand a little bit on that.
So I use that phrase, which was a phrase from Taylor Branch, author of the Parting the Water civil rights books. And he was in conversation with Isabel Wilkerson. And she recounts this conversation in her book, Caste. And they were talking about the rise of white domestic terrorism under Donald Trump, and specifically the Tree of Life massacre at the synagogue in Pittsburgh, which was a reaction to Trump's trying to scare whites about the so-called Central American caravan during the last midterm elections. And so Brandt says that all of this activity is a result. He says people said they would not stand for being a minority in their own country. And this was a backlash to the country's changing racial demographics. He says, I guess the real question is, if offered a choice between democracy and whiteness, how many would choose whiteness? And then Wilkerson says, we let that hang in the air for a minute, neither of us willing to hazard a guess as to that one. And so what I try to lay out in the introduction is how we were quite literally having this choice. The essence of Donald Trump's power is his being a champion and the leader of whiteness and white people. And we forget, and I didn't even fully appreciate it. I went back and started doing the research. Trump was not particularly powerful or popular before he got in the presidential race. He was polling at 4% in the polls in May of 2015. And then when he started attacking Mexicans, when he started sending the signal about this wall and immigration that he was going to defend this people in this country from the brown people across the border, his numbers took off. Within a month, he went from 4% to 24%, front of the pack, and never looked back, and led as presided as president as an unapologetic champion of whiteness, defending the Confederacy, defending the white nationalists who killed Heather Heyer in a protest in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, saying that there were good, fine people on both sides, telling congresswomen of color that they should go back where they came from, talking about S-hole countries. So he was very clearly the champion of whiteness and the notion that this should be a white country. Ta-Nehisi Coates writes very eloquently about this. He has an Atlantic article talking about him being the first white president. So we had a choice between that and democracy on January 6th, where every governor in this country, Republican and Democrat, had certified the election results showing that Joe Biden had been elected president. That's a democracy. And people chose whiteness. They went to the Capitol to stop the democratic process. And the majority of Republicans voted against democracy when they voted to throw out the results in key states. And so this very much frames up where we are at in this country. And Reverend Warnock talks about, we're going to be a January 5th country where we have elected a Jew and the successor to Martin Luther King to the United States Senate, or are we going to be a January 6th country which tramples on democracy and disregards all of our country's institutions and disregards the vision that we should be a multiracial democracy? So that remains the primary struggle and battle within this country's politics to this day.
It's so interesting that you mentioned Reverend Warnock there, because I think the victory that he had, and basically the victory of voting rights advocates had in the success in that special runoff election for those 2 Senate seats, those results came out that morning. And then that was completely overshadowed when we saw what happened on January 6th, and to see the contrast of both of those events. So how do we get back to being a January 5th democracy instead of January 6th?
Well, we follow the lead of those who made January 5th possible. And so the second half of my book, I offer case studies of 5 places that have gone through significant transformation, formerly strongholds of the Confederacy, and have actually made significant progress towards multiracial democracy and significant progress in terms of transforming the country. And first and foremost among those is Georgia. And so I feature Georgia. I feature the work of Stacey Abrams as illustrative of the work that's taken place in other places: San Diego, Harris County, Texas, Virginia, San Diego. And I talk about there's a liberation battle plan. The Confederates have had a Confederate battle plan they've been pursuing ever since 1865. But there's also a liberation battle plan that involves what I call level 5 leader, somebody who's personally self-effacing but very driven for the cause, strong civic engagement organizations, detailed data-driven plans, and playing the long game. And that's the work that Stacey Abrams began. I met Stacey Abrams back in 2012. And she said to me then, we lose by about 200,000 votes in Georgia. There's 1.5 million non-voting people of color. I'm going to go register them to vote. And steadily over the course of a decade, she did that work, raised the foundation, the people of color participating in the elections. That's what brought her to the precipice of winning in 2018. And continuing that work is what enabled the Biden to win Georgia, and what enabled Warnock and Ossoff to win Georgia. And it's what enabled Biden to win Georgia in a surprising fashion to him. I titled my Georgia chapter, Georgia, That's Not One We Expected, which is what Biden said on election night, because he hadn't been paying attention to what Stacey Abrams and others had been doing. But that's the fundamental lesson: is find the leaders and the groups who are doing the work to transform the population majority into a voting majority. And that's how we go about bringing about significant change.
But in fact, in the introduction of your book, you say that the book is actually a love letter in many ways to those community organizers, those people who are working directly in those communities, who don't often get the acknowledgement of the really important work that they're doing. And you mentioned there Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and there are so many other folks. Talk us through that. Why do we not lift up those voices more in progressive circles, because they're literally the boots on the ground, going out, registering people to vote, talking to people in their communities, and they're doing it in the face of what's happening around voter suppression, the gerrymandering, and yet they're showing up day after day and they're being effective.
Yeah, I think there's like 2 or 3 core systemic reasons why the progressive Democrats are behind the curve on this issue. And so one of them, the people are just they're not just bad at math, but they're behind the times. They think the electorate is a different electorate than it used to be. So historically, politics used to be largely a contest between white people. And then progressive whites would be battling among conservative whites for the whites in the middle. But the country's composition has changed. People of color were just 12% of the composition of the country in the 60s. People of color are now 40%. So progressive whites aligned with people of color is now the majority. But too much, most, I would say, even of mainstream Democratic politics is still focused on the old way of doing politics, of where you're trying to win over and not alienate, as opposed to swing voters in the middle. So that's one of the problems. Another problem is that Isabel Wilkerson says in Caste that we are all actors on a stage where the roles were set long before we arrived. And we know who has the role of the leading man, center stage, who is on the side, who's the sidekick. And if you think about it, we've had 46 presidents in this country, all of them men, 45 of them white men. So the role of president is reserved for a man as we think about it. And so when we think about brilliant political strategists and leaders, et cetera, we don't think about a Latina woman like Andrea Guerrero in San Diego or Michelle Tremillo in Texas as the leading force. But those are people who built organizations from scratch to be multi-million-dollar electoral powerhouses that have brought hundreds of thousands of people into the electorate and have changed those regions. But we have a conception of what leadership looks like that does not comport. And Stacey herself had this. She was not initially universally embraced. I'm on this journey with her for a long time, and I know how hard it was to get the level of acceptance and support from a lot of these mainstream progressive, in theory, institutions.
Well, in addition to not understanding really what leadership looks like in terms of, you know, racial diversity and in a multiracial society, as you said, Steve, we don't even understand what the electorate looks like. And when I say we, it's really, you know, the powers that be, the Democratic Party. And I'd like you to talk about the new majority index. And this is something that you discuss a lot, about how the fact that we actually need to look at politics really through a prism of race. That's one of the major indicators. And yet there's been consistent failures to do that. What is the new majority index, and why do we need to look at racial identity as a very important predictive factor when it comes to political behavior?
Right. And so even just as a statistical matter, I think there's been a lot of resistance to focusing on race, and people like to think that they think it's improper or wrong. The way to deal with the realities of race is to not think about it or focus on it or talk about it. And so there's a inclination to ignore it. But even setting aside the historical and sociological, merits of that decision, strictly from a statistical standpoint, there is a profound racial gap in voting behavior. Now, that has sociological and historical reasons for that, but it exists incontrovertibly, statistically. And so if you look at every presidential election since 1976, when they started exit polling by race, polling people in the exit polls by race, nearly 90% of African Americans vote for the Democratic nominee. 88% is the average. Obviously, Obama was 96. And it's 41% of whites who vote for the Democratic nominee. So that's almost 50-point gap between Black and white voter behavior. So strictly from a statistical standpoint, that data set should be incorporated in our analysis of election results and election potential. But it's not. And so the main forces, organizations that do political analysis, so Nate Silver's 538, they crunch polling data. They look at the polling results, and they do an average of polling data. Cook Report does this partisan voter index, which is a useful piece, but I don't think it goes deep enough. So they look at past presidential results. They look at a congressional district. How did that district vote for the president in the past? And then how does that compare to the national average? And that's a useful data point. In the new majority index, we do that as well. But then we go further and we look at the racial composition of the district. What's the percentage of people of color within that district? And then what's the gap between the voter turnout of people of color and the voter turnout of whites in that district? And we factor in, if you increase the turnout of voters of color to more normalize it where the level of whites is, what then is the electoral implications of that? And so the Cook Political Report, they have a partisan voter index. We have a new majority index. So a district would be, R Republican +2 or D +3. And our numbers are different, and they show more progressive potential if you were to actually focus in on mobilizing voters of color, which is what Stacey Abrams did, which is what Joe Biden didn't see, which is why he said that's not one we expected. So it's the first analytical index of congressional races that specifically incorporates racial data. And that's what the new majority index is.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching. Let us know your thoughts on this conversation. You can drop us a comment in the comment box. And how are you impacted by this? Is this an aspect of our democracy that you've been paying attention to? We'd love to have you be part of the conversation. Steve, just to further expand on what you were saying there about, especially on the incredible work that Stacey Abrams did and so many other folks, turning out people, getting people registered and really turning out the vote. We're seeing this massive backlash against that playing out in states all around the country, and particularly those states that did see a huge turnout of voters, with the voter suppression laws going in that are directly targeting those voters. Talk a little bit about that and how that is really a backlash to that enormous get out the vote and the successful get out the vote campaigns that we have seen.
Yeah, and that's a core part of what I call the Confederate battle plan. Right, that they have one of the components I describe is ruthlessly rewrite the rules. And so ever since the end of the Civil War, there has been this aggressive, multidimensional attempt to stop people of color from voting. South Carolina and Mississippi were majority Black after the Civil War. So they had to stop people of color from voting. So it was a combination of that's how the Ku Klux Klan got created. It got created 6 months after the end of the Civil War by former Confederates, and it existed as a terrorist organization to terrorize people into not voting. And then that was matched by changing the rules, all manner of different schemes to get away with trying to preserve white political power and to isolate and marginalize people of color. Grandfather clauses, poll taxes, all of that stuff back to the 1900s. And then, as well as things like white primaries, which I didn't even know until I started researching the book. Kara Anderson talks about in her book, One Person, No Vote. We had in the South, in Texas in particular, whites-only primaries through the 1920s and 30s. And the only way people could vote in the Democratic primaries. And the courts were upholding this, saying that well, the political parties are private actors, so they're not susceptible to government and constitutional laws and whatnot. So you can have a whites-only primary as long as the general election is not whites-only. In the South, there were only Democrats in terms of who was really able to vote, certainly in terms of the whites down there. So there's a long history of voter suppression as a core component of disempowering people of color, preserving the political power of white people. And so that's what we saw in 2021 is a huge, well, you actually saw it in 2009, you saw a lot, in 2010, a lot of it after Obama was elected. And this rise of voter ID laws, attempts to, again, stop people of color from voting in large numbers. And then you saw it again in 2021 after Trump was ousted, a whole slew of proposals. Like in Harris County, Texas, they had 24-hour voting and drive-through voting. So then they voted to outlaw those types of things. Drop boxes made it easier for people to be able to drop their ballots off. They're trying to eliminate drop boxes. And so you would think in a democracy, you would want to make it easier for people to vote. But that's not how people function. And so this notion about restricting democracy is a core part of the Confederate battle plan, but that's also why it's a critical part of the liberation battle plan. because we have to expand democracy. The conservatives and the modern day Confederates know that voting is their greatest weakness, and we need to know that it's our greatest strength.
I want to talk more about the liberation battle plan in just a moment, but we're just weeks away from the midterm elections. How should we be looking at that through the prism of race, through everything that we've been talking about? The polls, are indicating one thing, but how are you looking at the upcoming midterms and the elections that are coming in just a couple of weeks' time?
So it's all elections, and these midterms as well, come down to voter turnout. And this is what people don't appreciate. And frankly, a lot of people in the media are more drawn to narratives, and there's like this storyline, and that's affecting the arc of what's going to happen, et cetera. The fundamental issues are people going to turn out to the polls because there is, in fact, a new American majority. In every presidential election back to 1992, the Democratic nominee has won the popular vote, with the sole exception of 2004. And so that's a pretty strong data track record that when large numbers of people vote, presidential elections are the largest turnout, that the Democrats are going to win, that the idea that there should be a multiracial democracy has majority support. But what happens in midterms is that people either get complacent or busy, and are not motivated to turn out in those same numbers. And when that happens is when you have the bad results for progressives and Democrats. So to me, the whole question is, what does our voter turnout operation look like? How much are we actually doing to mobilize to get people to the polls? And if we do, Democrats can both hold the House. Biden won the most votes in 226 of the congressional districts, that even after the redistricting, in terms of their composition. And so the Democratic majority is in those districts if we get them out to the polls. And that's what the final weeks of the election need to be about, investing in the groups that do voter mobilization work. Texas Organizing Project, New Virginia Majority, Arizona Wins, those types of entities need to be funded and supported to get the new American majority to the polls so their power can be felt in the election results.
Well, as you said, that's a core component of the liberation battle plan. And that's really what you lay out in the second half of your book, How We Win the Civil War. Beyond the results of the upcoming elections, because we know they will be challenged, there is now this narrative that is being put out, regardless, that any election that doesn't go the Republicans' way is stolen. And we know that those narratives still exist from the 2020 election, and they're already being put out there about the midterms. So what do we do after Election Day? How do we continue to enforce this liberation battle plan? What are the next steps?
So, well, first we have to protect and defend the election results, and so that's that's a lot of the work that had to happen after the 2020 election, as Trump was trying to unearth it. Is that you've got to oversee the counting, the validation of the votes, make sure election results aren't thrown out and they don't throw out the votes that the people of color. But more fundamentally, as we go to 2023 and beyond, we have to institutionalize the expansion of democracy to the extent that we can. I talk a little bit in the book about how in San Diego, Andrea Guerrero of Alliance San Diego has given the example to me about, because San Diego's on the Mexican border, so in San Diego, you hear ads on the radio for the upcoming elections in Mexico on a regular basis, almost on an hourly basis, but you don't hear that on the radio for elections in San Diego. And so what are we doing to use the institutions that we have, the platforms that we have, to really make voting as popular, as accessible, as easy as possible? Because that's going to be our strongest way to beat back the attacks that we're facing and to really manifest the power of the new American majority, of those who want to create a multiracial democracy that works for everybody.
So much of your book is about storytelling, and I know that you really embrace stories as a way to connect us to all of these different concepts. And how do we get those stories out in the media? I mean, you said earlier that we don't often see the right type of analysis of our elections in the media. What do we need to do in the media to make sure that those narratives, those community organizers, those very successful community organizers that you highlight in your book, how do we elevate those voices? And how do media consumers, the viewers, the listeners, the readers, demand that type of election coverage from the media? Because it does seem that is a crucial part of this and our whole understanding of what's happening with elections.
Yeah, I do think that in the modern social media era, there is more potential for the regular person to hold media accountable. I used to think that I used to say that the least accountable sectors in society were the media and philanthropy, right? Because who's going to tell people giving money away they're wrong? And what's the thing about don't pick an argument with somebody who buys ink by the barrel? It's the old saying, but we don't have ink anymore in terms of how the word actually gets out. So I think there's a chance to be more vigilant and to call out people in the media using the social media platforms for their exclusion of the people doing the work and of the voices of people of color, and for their obsession with the different swing white voter population, which is a shrinking part of the population rather than the growing communities of color. And so, people could be tweeted at or put on Facebook around why are they not talking about this work, and why are they continuing to go down these these old narratives that are just very familiar to them. But it's really finding, backing, supporting the work of the leaders and the groups who are expanding the electorate. And these leaders are in most states in the country, and they do need the enthusiastic backing, sponsorship, championing, just by regular people putting their stories out into the world.
Stephen, the last couple of minutes that we have, I mean, what keeps you going? How do you keep fighting this fight every day? Because I've heard you speak and I've read your stories about your own experience growing up in Ohio, your family's direct experience of the housing discrimination, how you were inspired as a young 20-something young Black man by Reverend Jesse Jackson's presidential bid in the 1984. You've been fighting this fight for decades now. How do you keep going, especially as we are seemingly, as you said earlier, we're still in the trenches very much of a civil war?
Well, and what keeps me going is we're making great progress. And so even though it's back and forth, and you see when you look at it through the sweep of history, right? So I came of age politically in the Rainbow Coalition, Jesse Jackson's presidential campaigns, connected politics to the civil rights movement. Jesse got 3.5 million votes in 1984, 7 million votes in 1988. He was the largest, is the strongest runner-up in the Democratic primary election to that point. But then 20 years after that, Barack Obama was elected president of the United States of America. In 1992, Stacey Abrams was, protesting the racist flag in the Georgia state. At the state, Georgia's flag used to have the Confederate flag embedded in it. Now, Stacey Abrams has become one of the dominant forces in United States politics. And those stories that I tell within the book, Virginia was the literal capital of the Confederacy. They've won 9 out of 10 past statewide elections in Virginia. They've provided Medicaid and healthcare expansion to 400,000 people in Virginia. So if you look at the arc, it's actually quite popular. I mean, we're at this inflection point now. It could easily go backwards. But when you think about where we've come from, that's what is so encouraging to me. Well, so one of my friends that asked me what was I most excited about in the book is that because people of color are always told, yeah, people of color stuff is important, but we have to win. So that has to take a back seat. But we are winning. And that's what was motivating me around the book. Is we've won in Georgia, we've won in Arizona, we've won in Harris County, Texas, we won in San Diego, we won in Virginia. And so that is very inspiring to me, that we have done this work and seen the results. And so it has proven the theory of the case. And now I see my mission is trying to get the word out, is to follow the lessons from what those victories tell us.
Well, Steve Phillips, thank you so much for being our guest today on Just Solutions.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Don't forget that you can catch Just Solutions as a podcast. Subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts and never miss an episode. And find past episodes online at freespeech.org. Join us same time, same place next week for another conversation from Free Speech TV's Just Solutions.